Today's topic is 14 AWS config strategies, and I'm Chris, founder of systemsarchitect.io. Untracked configuration drift is how small misconfigurations turn into real incidents, and AWS Config is the service built to catch it before that happens. Get these 14 strategies right, and you turn config from a passive record keeper into an active compliance and governance engine across your entire AWS footprint. 14 AWS config strategies. 1. Establish multi-region AWS config recording. 2. Implement aggregated view with Config Aggregator. 3. Define custom config rules with Lambda. 4. Enable automated remediation actions. 5. Integrate config with EventBridge. 6. Implement resource-based recording. 7. Enable configuration history. 8. Utilize conformance packs. 9. Set up S3 lifecycle policies for config data. 10. Enable organization-wide config rules. 11. Implement config rule tagging strategy. 12. Configure SNS notifications. 13. Integrate with Security Hub. 14. Implement periodic rule evaluation. 1. Establish multi-region AWS config recording. AWS Config is a regional service, so a recorder configured in one region has no visibility into resources running anywhere else. Why does multi-region matter? Deploying a configuration recorder in every region you operate in closes that gap and gives you a complete inventory of what actually exists, since an unmonitored region can hide resources entirely from your compliance program. Pair regional recorders with a consistent set of rules across every region. A practical tip is to enable config through AWS organizations or infrastructure as code so new regions are never left unmonitored by accident. 2. Implement aggregated view with Config Aggregator. A config aggregator pulls configuration and compliance data from multiple accounts and regions into a single queryable view instead of logging into a dozen accounts to check status separately. This is especially valuable once you're running config across separate production, staging, and sandbox accounts. Aggregators can be built from an AWS organization source, which automatically includes new accounts as they're created. A good practice is to host the aggregator in a dedicated, access-controlled audit account. 3. Define custom config rules with Lambda. AWS Config ships with a large catalog of managed rules, but no managed rule can anticipate every internal policy your organization needs enforced. Custom rules backed by a Lambda function let you evaluate resource configurations against exactly the standards your business defines. This is also how you encode institutional knowledge that would otherwise live only in a wiki page or a reviewer's head. Start small, targeting the specific gaps managed rules leave rather than replacing the entire managed rule library at once. 4. Enable automated remediation actions. Detecting a non-compliant resource is only half the job if a human still has to manually fix it every time. AWS Config supports automated remediation through AWS Systems Manager automation documents, letting you attach a corrective action directly to a rule's non-compliant evaluation, whether that means re-enabling encryption, closing an open port, or applying a missing tag. This dramatically shortens the window between detection and resolution, though higher risk changes can still require manual approval first. Start with remediation on low-risk, well-understood rules before expanding it further. 5. Integrate config with EventBridge. AWS Config emits events for configuration changes and compliant state transitions, and Amazon EventBridge is how you turn those events into automated workflows. Why route events through EventBridge? Instead of periodically polling config for status, You can route events straight to a Lambda function, an SNS topic, or a step function's workflow the moment they occur, enabling real-time response to violations. A useful tip is to route different compliance domains, like security versus cost governance, to separate event bridge targets. 6. Implement resource-based recording. Recording every supported resource type in every account sounds thorough, but it also means paying for and processing configuration items you may never need. Config lets you scope the recorder to specific resource types, focusing on what truly matters for your compliance goals. Scoping too narrowly can leave real compliance gaps if you cut resource types you'll need later. As a practical starting point, record everything in your most critical accounts and scope recording down in lower risk, low change environments. 7. Enable configuration history. Beyond point-in-time compliance checks, AWS Config keeps a full history of how each resource's configuration has changed over time. This is invaluable during an incident investigation, since it lets you pinpoint exactly when a security group rule changed or an IAM policy was modified. It's stored in your designated S3 bucket as configuration items, giving you durable, queryable records outside the live console. A good habit is to periodically spot check that history is capturing the resource types you expect. 8. Utilize conformance packs. Why use conformance packs? Conformance packs bundle config rules and remediation actions into a single deployable template, letting you roll out an entire compliance framework in one step. AWS publishes sample packs aligned to common frameworks, including operational best practices for PCI DSS, HIPAA security, and the CISAWS Foundation's benchmark. This comes from systemsarchitect.io. See the full section there. Also, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more, and check the video notes for links. Because a conformance pack is just a YAML template, it fits naturally into a version-controlled infrastructure as code workflow, and deploying it through organizations ensures every member account inherits the same baseline automatically. 9. Set up S3 lifecycle policies for config data. Configuration snapshots and history accumulate continuously, and without a retention plan, that data can drive up S3 storage costs indefinitely. S3 lifecycle policies let you transition older config data to cheaper storage classes, such as S3 Glacier, and expire it once it's no longer needed. It's worth aligning your lifecycle rules with your actual audit cycle, since some frameworks require data retained for several years. A sensible tip is to tier data to infrequent access storage before moving it to Glacier, since audit teams occasionally need recent history at short notice. 10. Enable organization-wide config rules. Managing config rules account by account doesn't scale once you're operating dozens or hundreds of accounts under AWS organizations. Organization config rules let you define a rule once and have it automatically apply across every member account in scope, guaranteeing a consistent compliance baseline organization-wide. It also closes a common gap where a newly provisioned account has no compliance rules until someone remembers to add them. A practical approach is to use organization rules for your non-negotiable baseline and account-level rules for anything workload-specific. 11. Implement config rule tagging strategy. INGUB. As your rule count grows across managed rules, custom rules, and conformance packs, keeping track of who owns what becomes its own management challenge. Tagging config rules with metadata like owner, purpose, and compliance framework makes it possible to filter, report, and audit rules systematically. A clear tagging strategy also speeds up incident response, since responders can quickly identify which team to contact. A good starting tip is to standardize on a small, mandatory tag set applied consistently from day one. 12. Configure SNS notifications. Amazon SNS notifications from AWS Config ensure that compliance state changes reach the people who need to act on them, without anyone having to log in and check manually. You can configure config to publish to an SNS topic whenever a resource's compliance status changes, and fan that out to email, chat, or a ticketing system, keeping teams promptly informed of new violations. A practical tip is to route only actionable, high-signal notifications through SNS and let EventBridge handle the finer-grained automation. 13. Integrate with Security Hub. Why integrate with Security Hub? Why integrate with Security Hub aggregates findings from multiple AWS security services, and config compliance results feed directly into that consolidated view alongside findings from services like GuardDuty and Inspector, giving your team a single unified security posture to monitor. Because Security Hub can aggregate across accounts and regions similarly to a Config Aggregator, the two work well together in a multi-account setup. A useful tip is to let Security Hub drive your unified alerting while keeping config as the source of truth for the raw configuration data. 14. Implement periodic rule evaluation. Most config rules evaluate resources reactively, triggered by a configuration change, but some drift doesn't originate from a track change at all. Periodic evaluation lets you run a rule on a fixed schedule, such as every 24 hours, catching conditions a change-triggered rule alone might miss, like a certificate approaching expiration or an IAM credential aged past a rotation policy. It's worth choosing evaluation frequency deliberately, since overly frequent checks add unnecessary cost without a proportional benefit. A sound approach is to reserve periodic evaluation for rules that genuinely depend on the passage of time. To wrap up, these 14 strategies turn AWS Config from a background service into a coordinated compliance and governance system. Start with multi-region recording and aggregation so nothing is invisible. Layer in custom rules and conformance packs to encode your actual standards, and close the loop with automated remediation, EventBridge, and Security Hub so violations get resolved instead of just logged. Tackle them in roughly this order, and your compliance posture will improve steadily rather than requiring a disruptive overhaul. Thanks for checking this out. Hope you learned something. Find a lot more articles and guides on both systemsarchitect.io and codeguides.io.